What's up guys, it's the Sound Alchemist, and today we come to part 3 of the burning of Prospero. This time, we have come to the epic battle that takes place in the homeworld of the Thousand Suns. So let us dive into this epic battle. News of the sanctioned fleet of Space Wolves, Adeptus Custodes, and Sisters of Silence had reached the ears of the newly corrupted Horus. Sensing an opportunity, the War Master contacted Leman Russ, commander of his fleet, during the trip to Prospero. Speaking with his brother, he was able to convince him that bringing Magnus to Terra was a waste of time and effort. Horus then confirmed to his traitorous Council of War that he believed that this interjection into the Emperor's own decree would result in Magnus never leaving Prospero alive. So Horus ordered Leman Russ to destroy the Thousand Suns on Prospero. But before committing his forces to attack, Leman Russ still attempted to communicate with his brother Magnus. He believed that Caspar Hauser was a hidden one of the Thousand Suns, and Russ attempted to speak through Magnus, through this Space Marine. However, he was not a hidden one, but was actually a pawn of chaos designed to appear as one, and thus the message was never received. Leman Russ ordered the attack. With no orbiting fleet, Prospero had to rely on her orbital defense batteries as first-line protection. These stations lasted but mere moments, when torpedo spreads aimed at them released them from Imperial vessels. Survivors of these torpedo attacks were bracketed and then obliterated by long-range gunfire as the Wolves' fleet closed in. Taking up orbit themselves, the Space Wolves vessels commenced saturation of orbital strikes upon the entire planet. Magma bombs, directed energy weapons, and mass drivers, and even ballistic weapons were unleashed upon the surface of Prospero in an assault that literally changed the surface of the world forever. Mountains were leveled, valleys filled with rubble, and seas were boiled away, flashed into mere steam. The very bedrock of Prospero was pounded and heated into new shapes, like metal upon the anvil. Boiling hot winds swept across the world, bringing with them the smell of heated metals and oil. This bombardment was so strong and sudden that moments after it began, only one population center still survived. It was a standing unit of Thousand Suns from the Raptora cult that kept a telekinetic shield generated over the city of Tisca. This shield was as hard as impenetrable as those generating it, but it was the last hope for anybody on Prospero. The telekinetic dome protecting the capital city of Tisca was very helpful, for it allowed the commanders of the Thousand Suns to learn what was happening from Magnus the Red himself. Magnus told his legion to give up any notion of defense and to just accept their deaths with honor. However, Chief Librarian Isaac Ariman realized that their legion was damned if they fought, and they were also damned if they didn't, for now they would always be deemed traitors in the eyes of the Imperium. So all the senior captains rallied behind Ariman, and they did not intend to perish without a fight. So the Thousand Suns took up their arms and readied for this epic battle between the Space Wolves. The Thousand Suns are a very prideful and arrogant legion, and they had assumed that Tisca would never face any close-in air attack, and so there were no anti-aircraft guns to threaten the landers of these stormbirds that pummeled the ground defenses. Leman Russ himself was the first attacker to set foot on Prospero, leading hundreds of Astartes into the systematic destruction of Tisca's coastline. An overwhelming majority of Space Wolves landed with no problems, immediately striking all out at any Thousand Suns around them. As the infantry waves linked up, the areas behind them burned and flattened, and they were clear for armor units to be airlanded. Predators, Land Raiders, Vindicators, and Whirlwinds were deployed. The first 3 types of vehicles assigned to methodically blast buildings into rubble and gun down any and all inhabitants that they saw. The Whirlwind artillery batteries were first assigned to strike symbolic targets, such as the statues of Magnus atop the Acropolis Magna, before being loosed in indiscriminate fire missions into areas of the city as yet untouched by the fighting. Loaded with incendiaries, they made sure that the City of Light burned. It was at this point that the Thousand Sons made their presence known. Azek Ahriman used the narrow streets of Tisca to his advantage. Here he peered down the length of his bolter and found the precognitive thread that would guide his shots into detonating the helm of one of the Space Wolves. The significance of this moment made him hesitate, when the result was that a charging Space Wolf opened fire first, smashing several of his Sekhmet warriors to the ground. This action broke Ahriman's hesitation, and he pulled the trigger, killing his first Space Wolf. However, mere moments after this, his unit of Thousand Sons began to fire into the wolves. Any survivors from this first volley of fire were then mauled with psychic powers, or even burned alive. Not a single Space Wolf from this attack lived, and with clashes like this repeated everywhere, the Space Wolves met the first defensive line of the Thousand Sons. The counterattack strategy of the Thousand Sons soon made itself clear. Long thought dormant, the Titan, Canis Vertex, positioned in the front of the Pyramid like some grandiose statue, blossomed into life. Enthroned in a crystal projecting chamber at the peak of the Pyramid, the captain, Calopus, of the Magister Templi of the Pyre, and the Lord of Hellfire, used his powers to inhabit the Titan, taking control over its form. Thanks to the Athenians and the Corvidae being able to intercept and discern the Space Wolves' battle plans, Calopus was able to determine where the Space Wolves were overextending themselves. He then guided Canis Vertex across the Old City, while the Titan's weapons worked. Cophis was able to cause more and more destruction amidst the wolves by simply bombarding them with Titan-sized fist balls of pure warp flame. The wolves responded by directing aerial strikes against this Titan from any and all directions, but Calopus was able to keep an etherically charged fire shield around the Titan, incinerating any and all munitions, dissipating energy weapons, and melting the pilots of the attack craft into their seats if they flew too close. Canis Vertex was apparently unstoppable, and their line was holding. Finally, reports came in from non-Space Wolf attackers, such as the Adeptus Custodes. When they were first seen, they were making hit-and-run attacks from the back of their powerful jet bikes. While their presence was unsettling, members of the Thousand Sons swiftly discovered that despite their formidable reputation, Custodes died just as easily as anybody else, especially when struck by psychic energies. Now that it seemed that the Thousand Sons were not only holding their own, but also pushing back their attackers, they then concentrated on bringing in any surviving Thousand Sons and moving their civilians to their safest place left on Prospero, the Pyramid of Photep. But then the Sisters of Silence struck. The Thousand Sons wavered. They had to fall back some small distances or else lose their unit cohesion, until the tactic of concentrating on the sisters themselves resulted in enough of the Null Maidens to perish that allowed the Thousand Sons to once again gain access to their psychic powers. Throughout all of Tisca, thousands of Null Maidens were perishing by the moment, until they heard a grisly howl. Leman Russ had arrived at where the fighting was thickest. Despite their so far demonstrated superiority over the Space Wolves, the Thousand Sons fared poorly against Russ and his retinue, dying in the scores to his own assault. The sorcerers of the Thousand Sons knew that they had to kill Russ then and there, or else the day was lost. The sorcerer Aura Magma was the first to strike. He covered himself in a shield of pure warp flame and engaged Russ in mid-distance with concentrated lances of etheric energy. This attack momentarily staggered the Wolf King, and the watching Sons cheered as the Space Wolf's Primarch disappeared in an explosion of light. And there, their cheers were silenced, in that the Wolf King came out untouched from this intensity, and then he returned this attack to its source. His powers somehow seemingly nullified, Aura Magma suffered the horror of losing his immunity to warp flame, and his soul became incinerated by unquenchable fire. Any last words from him were mere screams of pain and agony. The Thousand Suns counterattack quickly lost momentum before the might of Russ. Takar then ordered Hathor Mat to pull them back and reform their position on the line further in. As Mat complied with this order, Takar then elected to remain behind, drawing all the strength from the warp that he possibly could. He directed his tutelage to engorge him with it. His powers were phenomenally boosted, and Takar burst through the ranks of the Space Wolves like a telekinetic missile, smashing aside and or crushing underneath all that got in his way. Rearing up before Russ, Takar's assault faced one last hurdle, the Emperor's own bodyguard, Constantine Valor. Valdor quietly raised his weapon and pointed it at him. He then called him monster. At this declaration, Takar realized that his overuse of his powers and his warp connection had resulted in his own flesh change. He was now a hideous, mutated beast, instead of a proud warrior scholar. Sadly, Takar lowered his defenses and allowed Valdor to slay him. Seeing that his legion was systematically falling apart at the hands of Russ and his warriors, Ahriman repeatedly tried to convince Magnus to come to their aid. However, their Primarch repeatedly refused him. The battle over Tiska's port proved to be almost as bloody and relentless as that surrounding Leman Russ, when failed Tauron's 7th Fellowship were struggling to hold back the repeated assaults by the Space Wolves. Despite their outstanding accuracy, with a notable kill count coming from headshots on helmetless Space Wolves, Tauron and his warriors had to face a concentrated assault of around 600 Space Wolves. He then allowed his men to impact the Space Wolves with their full psychic power, but that impact was then diluted by a pinpoint dreadnought assault. Tauron quickly found himself staring down the barrels of the dreadnought's weapons, and he responded by frantically linking up with the warp, flooding his body with immense power, powers that even he did not know he had. Tauron's body began levitating above the battlefield. He then shot out electric biopulses onto the wolves below, killing many with a mere flick of his wrist. He then took his eyes on a dreadnought, and he disassembled him piece by piece with his mere mental powers. He then noticed 2 more dreadnoughts, and he changed their minds into attacking their fellow Space Wolves. He was a one-man army, and the wolves knew he must be stopped. Any and all nearby Space Wolf battle tanks were ordered to take aim and fire at Tauron. However, his overpowered body refused to take damage from these shells. His body became overloaded with warp energy, and Tauron, however powerful he may be, could not take all this energy, and he exploded. This explosion shot a column of warp flame vertically into the sky, visible from all quarters of Tiska, and he rocked the city with the force of a warp core explosion. Any and all nearby to fail Tauron were incinerated. Any nearby survivors of the Thousand Suns were bombarded by psychic energy, and thus they succumbed to the flesh change. These monstrosities were either put down by the Thousand Suns themselves, or were forced to do suicide runs against the Space Wolves. Unfortunately for the Thousand Suns, the psychic shockwave from Tauron's death made way to the Titan known as Canis Vertex, and it caught him, overloading his senses and killing Kophis, his pilot. Kophis' own death released another warp fire explosion, taking out the majority of the Pyre Temple, while Canis Vertex collapsed on top of the Pyramid of the Corvidae. These triple explosions decimated the Thousand Suns in the area, tearing the heart out of their defensive lines, as well as their will to fight. Ahriman had no choice but to give the order for all Thousand Sun defenders to fall back, shrinking and tightening their defensive line. As they assembled in the Oculum Square, Ahriman realized just how costly the battle had been for his legion, as their numbers were now drastically reduced. He did take comfort, however, knowing that nearly all of the survivors were older and more experienced Marines, including Sobek and Hathor Mat. They now set up their new defensive perimeter, just as he saw Leman Russ, with 6,000 Astartes behind him, ready to charge at Ahriman and any surviving Thousand Sons. Ahriman paused for a moment to look over the battlefield and saw Leman Russ and his space wolves slaughtering his legion and destroying literally everything around them. Realizing that no matter what he did, he and his fellow Astartes' fates were sealed, so he discarded any plans he had, and he was ready to die fighting. And that is where we will leave off with this lore. So please stay subscribed so you can get the final epic conclusion to the burning of Prospero. Let me know what you guys thought about this epic assault on the capital city of Tisca. Did you enjoy the valiant efforts of the Thousand Sons? Or perhaps you were rooting for the vicious Space Wolves? Let me know in the comments down below. And also guys, don't forget that if you did enjoy this, we have many more epic videos on our YouTube page as well as on our Patreon page. So you guys can pledge a simple $1 to get these extra videos on Patreon. And as always guys, thank you for being awesome subscribers. And as always, you know me as a Sound Alchemist, part of One Mind Syndicate, and I am signing out.